male citizens. They could all vote. And it was kind of a mob. It was a mess. That's why we have something of a representative democracy, a Republican democracy, and that's really, I think, what we mean today when we talk about democracy. We mean some sort of a representative republic where we elect officials to vote for us. But in some cases, I think when we talk about expanding democracy in foreign countries, we have a very narrow view of what we mean by democracy. Sometimes we mean, say, just elections. Now, Larry Diamond suggests several basic elements of a working democracy in an article entitled, "What is Democracy?" I want to briefly touch on 4 of them and add one of my own. This is the first. A democracy is a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. That a lot of times is what we think of when we say democracy. That can work. The difficulty is if that's all that you have in a democracy, you obviously have the potential for majority tyranny of all kinds. Anybody that can get enough votes to do something can do essentially anything. So Diamond suggests a second requirement. A democracy requires the active participation of the people. I touched on Florida having just 40% voter turnout in the primary. Does that count as active participation of the people? Third, a democracy requires the protection of basic human rights of all of its citizens. We might call these what we think of in the Bill of Rights. We could have slightly different versions of human rights, but there has to be some sort of protection for basic human rights. Fourth, a democracy requires a basic rule of law. And fifth, and I suggest this is an addition to Diamond's 4, a democracy requires a minimal level of support for pluralism. Okay, so let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. First, a democracy is a means of choosing leaders based on the consent of the governed. The power of the government comes from the governed. Diamond suggests that to meet this standard, a democracy needs a neutral, free election with a secret ballot. No fraud. Now, note that the United States itself didn't have widespread use of the secret ballot until 1884, but the general idea is that if you go to vote in a free democracy, you have to be able to vote in such a way that someone can't pressure you to vote for a particular candidate. This happens in all sorts of places. Iran has elections every so often. They're not free and fair elections. One candidate wins 99% of the vote because when you go to vote, a security guard looks over your shoulder to make sure you're voting for the right candidate, and if you don't, they drag you off and punish you later, right? So everybody votes for the right candidate. Second, a democracy requires an active participation by the public in both politics and civic life. This idea, Diamond is saying, if citizens are not informed and engaged, it's a real problem in a democracy. Historically, this has been one of the primary arguments for education in the United States, one that's been recognized by the Supreme Court in cases like Wisconsin versus Yoder. Diamond says that a democracy needs the public to be involved in civil society through independent, non-governmental groups, what we might often call special interests. What's a special interest? Just a group of people who agree on a common goal. The ACLU is a special interest. The NRA is a special interest. The biggest special interest group in the country, biggest, most powerful special interest group in the country. Anybody have a guess? Yes, the AARP, by far the biggest, most influential, arguably best funded special interest group in the country. When they speak, Congress listens. They don't always do what the AARP says, but they listen very, very carefully and tread with fear and trembling if they're going to disagree. I suggest, though, that civic engagement needs to go beyond this. A working democracy needs an active public engaged in civic society through what Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America called civic associations. Tocqueville said that civic associations let citizens practice self-governance on a small scale and can be used to affect the political process. Tocqueville was talking about in early America in the 1830s, if you had a local community that needed something done, say a school build or a road, they would often get together and essentially create a club, and the club would do it. The club would figure out how much money was needed, they would raise money, and they would build a school. Earliest fire departments in the country started by Benjamin Franklin and clubs. Benjamin Franklin sent out letters in Philadelphia to a bunch of his friends and said, will you come meet me one Friday night a month, pay £2 or $2 a year for our funding, and we'll buy uniforms and water hoses and buckets and equipment. And they started a volunteer fire station. And that eventually spread throughout all of Philadelphia. And they had all sorts of penalties in their constitution. If you missed too many meetings, you had to pay a fine. If you missed more meetings, your name got in the paper. You know, as being somebody who said that you were going to support the fire department didn't actually do it. Tocqueville says These sorts of civic associations do at least two things that are really important. One, they help meet basic needs on a very local ground level. Two, they teach voter participation and engagement at a more national level. That is, if you are engaged locally, you will be encouraged to be engaged nationally. Today we have something of the opposite effect. The national government is perceived as sort of where everything happens, everything gets done. It's partially true, although local and state governments have a lot more money and a lot more influence at local levels than the federal government does. But people see, in general, that things get fixed by the federal government, and they kind of vote in federal elections, sometimes vote, but they vote far less often and are engaged far less often in local and state elections. If you've ever gone to a school board meeting, city council meeting, unless there's a really controversial issue up on the table that week, you might be the only person there. Maybe you and the spouse of some of the school board members. Maybe. They probably don't go. Very few people go. All right. Importantly, civic associations can keep people involved in democracy in more than just one day every 4 years. All right. Third, democracy requires the protection of human rights of all citizens. This means that people have fundamental rights that cannot be taken away by the government. However, I think that it's clear that the protected rights might look different in different countries. For example, it's entirely conceivable that one could have a democracy without the Second Amendment right to bear arms. You could have, that's not a human right that's essential to a democracy anywhere in the world. After all, one could also have a democracy without protection against self-incrimination. Some countries have a basic system of justice without a Fifth Amendment protecting you from self-incrimination. But it is difficult to see how one could have a working democracy without a fundamental right of conscience, as seen in the right to freedom of religion or freedom of speech. So, you can have a democracy where you vote. You can have a democracy where people are engaged. But if you don't have some basic agreement, either in a constitution or a common rule of law, or essentially something that the public and the governing leaders agree are basic rights that can't be violated, it's hard to see how you can have a long-term working democracy. Fourth is the idea of a rule of law, and that is that a government is made up of laws, not of men. Government is made up of laws, not of individuals. All citizens, and coupled with this is the idea that all citizens have to be equal under the law. If the rule of law is not followed in general, or if it applies differently to different people, it encourages a serious disrespect for the law in general. Take one example that I often pose to my students, and I'd love to see a show of hands here. How many of you have ever broken the speed limit? How many of you were not honest just now? Right? Has anyone ever witnessed somebody else violating the speed limit? I did on my way here, going down the interstate. In fact, I did both of these things. 55 miles an hour, I was going about 58, and there were people whizzing by me like I was standing still. Of course, the speed limit is one of those laws that is only sometimes enforced, and not always with a great deal of equality. That is, sometimes you might be pulled over for going 4 miles over the speed limit, and sometimes you might not get pulled over for going 20 miles over the speed limit. Part of that is simply we don't have policemen on every road. Part of it is that policemen in different areas enforce the speed limit with different degrees of precision. But it would bother us a great deal if we found out, for example, that elected officials were able to drive well over the speed limit with no penalty. At one point after college, I was working in South Carolina for a little bit with a public policy group, and it turned out that the lieutenant governor was pulled over for going 65 and a 35 right in front of the state capitol, and he didn't get a ticket. This was front page news for a week, right? Because it justifiably made people angry. This is wait a minute, the law should apply the same way to the lieutenant governor as it does to me. If I speed through a school zone, I ought to get in trouble. If the lieutenant governor speeds through a school zone, he ought to get in trouble. So, for democracy to work well, it requires a rule of law. That rule of law needs to be generally enforced most of the time, and it needs to be enforced equally for everybody. It's never going to be enforced all of the time, because human nature being what it is, we can't possibly enforce the law all of the time, but it needs to be seen as being enforced most of the time. And finally, I suggest that pluralism is important. What do I mean by this? A working democracy needs to have at least a basic level of support for pluralism, by which it must be willing to accept the opinions, views, and existence of religious and ethnic minorities.